Welcome everyone to this special edition of Growing Up in Science. If you have not been to Growing Up in Science before, this is a mentorship series where we normally highlight the behind the scenes stories of faculty, but we occasionally have themed events on topics of general interest. And what else could be of greater general interest than the climate crisis? Some would even say this is the defining issue of our time. And as much as we would like to sometimes separate our academic work from what else is going on in the broader world, that's not always the best strategy. And we're all here together in order to discuss that. Our guests, our speakers are Urai and Clare Kelly. They wrote this eLife paper on how to reposition yourself as an academic in light of the climate crisis. What can you do yourself? And they are going to lead the discussion. I'm going to make a few logistical remarks. First is that if you feel comfortable turning on your video, we would like that. Then it will feel more like a conversation. Second, if you are showing up as Urai, that's because of a slight mishap in the Zoom links. So you may want to rename yourself to whatever you prefer. And third, once you've done that, it would be wonderful if you could briefly introduce yourself in the chat. And thanks to those of you who have already done that. Questions during the talk are okay, right, Anna and Claire, or what do you prefer? Yes, questions during the talk are okay. You can type, and if I feel generous, I might even let you unmute yourself. But definitely at the end of the event, we hope to keep enough time for discussion. We really, really want everyone's input here. And the event is expected to go until 4:15 local time, so that would be an hour and 10 minutes from now, maybe a few minutes overflow. We'll see. Thank you very much, Anna and Claire, for doing this. Anna is faculty at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and Claire is faculty at Trinity College Dublin, and I'll let them take it from here.
Right, thanks, Luigi.
I'll share my screen.
So I think I'll start us off. Thanks everyone for introducing yourself, and thanks for being here, especially those whose evening it is, just like for us here in Europe. I hope everyone got the timing right and the names. And so yeah, together with Claire, we're really excited to share some of these ideas that we've been thinking about over the last half year or so, which are all written out in a lot more detail in this eLife paper, which is linked here. And we thought we would first briefly share our own kind of story of how we got here to be here today. So as Weiji said, I'm based in the Netherlands. I am a cognitive neuroscientist. I did my PhD in Germany, and then went to the US for a postdoc in rodent decision making. And for me, it was really starting in 2018 with the IPCC report that came out then, and more news about the climate crisis hitting my news bubble, I guess, that I became more and more worried and felt an increasing disconnect between the academic practices that I was engaging in, and the state of the world. So I think it started for me then to percolate a bit into my own scientific life, things like flying to conferences, the waste that we produce in labs, etc. So I guess with my own footprint, and especially since moving back to the Netherlands, to Leiden, I've been thinking much more about how to move also beyond thinking of my own footprint and to the social structures and the social change that needs to happen to address the climate crisis. And so I've been thinking about these ideas with Claire, and we've been kind of trying to flesh out a framework for doing that within academia that we really hope will be useful.
Thanks, Anna. As Reggie said, I'm Clare Kelly. I'm an associate professor in the School of Psychology in Trinity College Dublin. But I spent actually 10 years at NYU School of Medicine, so overlapped a little bit, I think, with Rachel there at NYU. And just in terms of how I got here, probably a somewhat similar story to Anna. I've always felt myself to be sort of environmentally aware and mindful of my own footprint. I'm a lifelong, bicycle commuter, even in New York City. But probably around the same time, 2018, 2019, started feeling similar to Anna, a very great disconnect between my awareness of what was happening and what I was doing, particularly in my professional life. And around the same time, or I think it was 2019, a paper from Adam Aaron came out. I think it was the one in TICS first, was it Trends in Cognitive Sciences, asking, what can cognitive scientists do about the climate crisis, and making an argument there for lots of different actions that we can do. But one of them kind of jumped out at me, which was to teach. And so even though I'm also a cognitive neuroscientist working on MRI, have not done any, environmental psychology or anything like that, I kind of seized on that as this is something I can do. I can upskill myself, learn as much as I need to learn about the psychology of the climate crisis, and I can launch a module. And so thankfully I had some very supportive colleagues who agreed to help me out, because I couldn't, because I didn't have that direct expertise. I couldn't do it all on my own, but I was able to get really amazing support from generous colleagues. And we put together a module, and now I've been teaching that for a couple of years. And then this, grew from networking, meeting on through this network of climate active neuroscientists, and then starting to think about, why is there such inertia in universities? Why aren't we doing more? So that's where this paper came from. But before we get stuck into some of, to summarize the paper, we were hoping to get to know you all a little bit more. So Weiji has already, and I think many of you have introduced yourselves, which is really lovely. It's great to see people from everywhere, and to hear, to see why you're here. And I suppose one of the things that we'd like to know is, and maybe this is is a bit of an obvious question, or maybe everybody will have the same answer to this question, but we wondered about the audience here, how worried are you about the climate crisis? And we thought we would take advantage. We can't do polls in this Zoom, but what you can do is you can respond to Anna's comment with an emoji. And so maybe we can get a bit of a poll going in that way. So I can already see some pretty worried looking faces there. So while you're doing that, I'll also I don't think anybody is so I think they're all kind of pretty worried faces. Wait. David Bubble, that's a pretty good way to capture the situation with emojis. I think that sums it up for a lot of us. So if you've already done that, or if you're thinking about that, we'd also like you to share a little bit about what you already do. So that's in your personal life, like what are the actions you take? And I think Anna's going to put some possibilities again into the chat so that people can respond to them. So what do you already do? What are the actions you already take in your personal life, in your political life, and in your professional life as an academic? And so these can range from those small things to using your keep cup and commuting, doing active commuting, or perhaps voting, or perhaps organizing. You know, do you already participate in these in your political, in your personal, your political, and your professional life? So if people wouldn't mind sharing these with us, that would be great to know how active people already are. So great, we have like 14 people who are active already in their personal and maybe in their political life already. So people probably feel like they vote on, you know, green issues already. And then professional life is a little bit more mixed. Some people, so people are definitely active, and some people are unsure. Great, maybe no. But a lot more, I suppose we can see a little bit of, there's definitely activity in personal life, in political life, and then maybe a little bit more mixed in professional life. So that's really useful. And again, David says, I do not do enough in my personal, political, or professional life. So medium on all of these. Great. Okay. And so finally, maybe people could indicate a little bit about what they would like to get out of this Growing Up in Science session. Maybe people could pop a few ideas in the chat to let us know how we can best use this time with you, and how we can best, make it work for you. So to meet like-minded folks eager to make a difference, I think that's a great a great idea, and that's what we would really like to think about, how we can connect people through this meeting, and maybe to maintain those connections afterwards, so we can figure that out as we go. Let's overhaul academia. Yeah, I love it. Identify actionable items, hear about what other people are doing, brainstorm what you can actually do. So lots of people are looking for really concrete suggestions, maybe working towards a code of conduct. What can we do? What are the options that we have? Looking for inspiration. Great. Brilliant. Okay, so ways to connect, ways to take action, new ideas, learning about the realms of possibility, how we can pressure our employers to divest. Great. Okay, so I hope that we can do at least some of these things. Great. So if anything else comes to you while I'm talking, please continue to pop suggestions in the box, and Anna may be able to respond while I'm talking. So I'm just going to start off this kind of, overview or summary of our paper, hopefully just to remind you of what we talked about it, and to get the discussion going. But this, I'm sure I don't have to tell this story to anyone here. This is our predicament. Despite almost 4 decades of commitments and promises and protocols and agreements and accords, emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are generated by human activities, primarily our burning of fossil fuels, these continue to rise unabated, and have already increased global temperatures by 1.1 degree Celsius over pre-industrial levels. We've also exceeded safe boundaries on several other Earth systems processes, including biodiversity loss, and we are headed for irreversible impacts. So we are in an ecological emergency that directly threatens the well-being, safety, and livelihoods of those alive today and future generations. And we know that these adverse impacts are unequally distributed across the world, with those who have contributed least to greenhouse gas emissions already suffering the greatest and most immediate impacts. And we also know that the severity of the adverse impacts felt by those born today, who should live to see the end of this century. You know, when we talk about end of the century, it seems for so many people as an abstract thing so far away, but children born today should live to see the end of the century, and how severe the adverse effects they feel, the degree of heating they experience depends very much on our actions now. But globally, we are not doing enough.
We have an issue with somebody vandalizing the disable annotations. How do I do that again? Can you stop sharing for a moment?
Yeah.
Adventure. Okay, so somebody is Zoom bombing this. I'm going to first make sure they can unmute themselves, and I'm not sure how to disable annotations. Can anybody help me with this?
I don't see it. Does Jason Moore know how he suggested? Oh, who can share? Host only. I switched it, so hopefully that's the whiteboard though.
Okay, all right. So you may want to try again. Okay, so it's if you started the shared screen, click more in the screen share controls for the annotation settings. Thank you, Gretchen, and several others. Okay, Claire, do you want to try again?
Thanks for sticking with us.
That's okay. Great, thank you. What have I done with it? Hold on, sorry. Okay.
No worries.
Lost my screen. Okay, sorry, I see what happened. That was still maximized.
I wonder if this has to do with the IPCC graphs coming here on the screen, or this being a regular occurrence at growing up in science.
No, this doesn't normally happen, but
a sensitive topic still for many, although it shouldn't be.
Okay, so I was just saying that, you know, the people born today will you know, directly experience some really adverse impacts unless we act now. But as we all know, we're just not doing anywhere near enough. You know, while better than a world with no climate policies at all, our current trajectories are completely inconsistent with a goal of keeping warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Right now, according to the implemented policies, we're on track for about 3.2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So as the latest IPCC report states really clearly, to have any chance of limiting warming to 1.5 or even 2, we need rapid, deep and immediate greenhouse gas emissions reductions in all sectors this decade, which means, you know, right now. So why is there this huge gap between what we're doing and what we need to do? Analyses of this collective failure to bend the emissions curve repeatedly identify vested interests, the powerful role of vested interests, particularly fossil fuel companies. And these, you know, vested interests manage to maintain their legitimacy through ingrained norms and the support of societal institutions like academia. So as academics, we have a central role to play in really pushing to stop supporting and stop legitimizing the activities of these industries that deeply harm our biosphere. And I do mean all academics. So, obviously there are people working in the areas of climate science and ecosystems, and they are doing amazing work, and they have been shouting at the top of their lungs about our situation for 2 decades now. So they can't do this alone, and we can't expect them to. So how can we do this? How can we change the practices of the most powerful people and corporations in our societies and our economies, those at the top of the pyramid of power, when we feel like we are just bricks in the wall or cogs in the machine. But the climate activists at 350.org have shown us that this understanding of this kind of traditional view of power actually leaves all the power in the hands of the oil execs. And what we need to do instead is to flip the script and view the foci of unjust power as located in a very precarious position that relies on these pillars of support to prop them up. And so to address the climate crisis, we need to dismantle these pillars of support for these vested interests who are only interested in maintaining the status quo of record profits that are gained from climate and ecological destruction. And this includes the pillars of support that are provided by academic institutions and academic research. So I might hear another but of hesitation or nervousness. What about objectivity? What about academics being balanced and avoiding normative stances on issues like the climate crisis? Besides the fact that this relies on a kind of idea, an impossibility of operating in a value-free vacuum, which we know we don't do. A review of history tells us that this just isn't the case for academia at all. There was a really nice paper from Fernando Racimo and colleagues in eLife last year that outlines how advocacy and activism used to be hallmarks of academia, and their beautiful timeline of activists, of scientist activists throughout the ages here really shows this. So from the women's suffrage movement, through environmental protections, through anti-war, anti-nuclear proliferation, to modern day, where we have scientists, activists, really embracing their responsibilities as scientists, educators, and citizens, and campaigning for climate action. So universities have really enormous potential to catalyze transformational societal change, and that's thanks to our mission, thanks to our reason for being. Our research informs understanding and can inform policy for mitigation and adaptation, and the privilege that we have of educating the next generation has the potential to set off ripple effects that can really push society towards the social tipping points we need for transformation. But as I've already said, so many of us just experience this kind of action paralysis. We just feel, besides that idea of being powerless and what difference can I make anyway, we worry, that we don't have the right expertise, that I should stay in my lane. I don't know anything about this. What can I contribute? Or do I have to change what I do? Can I not fly to conferences anymore? Do I have to change everything? But the crux of the argument that we put forward in the paper is that an even greater barrier to climate action amongst academics is this increasingly corporatized, target-driven, stressful nature of modern academic life, which we have argued exceeds kind of reasonable human limits and just robs us of time, headspace, motivation to kind of grapple with this existential crisis that we face. And so to remove these barriers to action, we need to rethink academia. And we need to do that because there are no universities on a dead planet. So we really need to take action. So it turns out that a really nice framework for this kind of rethinking already exists. And hopefully people here will already have been familiar with Kate Raworth's Doughnut Economics, or were able to have a quick look at the TED Talk to get a great overview. And it's really wonderful. It's such a transformative theory and idea. And so in her book from 2017, Raworth argues that what is at the heart of the twin crises of global inequality, economic inequality, and the ecological chaos and the climate crisis is outdated economic thinking. And to work our way out of this situation, we need to think about economics in a whole new way. And so at the heart of her framework is this donut made out of an inner ring and an outer ring. The inner ring is the social foundation for human well-being that we should all have access to. Things like water, food, housing, education, a political voice, peace, gender equality. And on the outer ring are the planetary boundaries that we must not overshoot, like biodiversity loss and climate change. And so Raworth's call to action is that society should not aspire to boundless economic growth, which is what is at the heart of our societies and our economies right now, growth for growth's sake. But instead, we should aim to live well within this ecologically safe and socially just space within the donut. And to enable this, this movement back to within this safe and just space for humanity, Raworth outlines 7 new principles of economic thought, these fundamental shifts in our thinking that are required. And in our paper, we adapted those. We took the principles she outlined and we have adapted them for academia. So just before I hand over to Anna, who's going to talk through the principles, the first thing that we did was we imagined an academic donut. So we directly translated Raworth's idea. And so we have this academic donut, which is bounded by this inner social foundation of the things that we all want to thrive as academics, right? Secure, satisfying careers, academic freedom, equality, diversity, inclusion, work that has meaning, that provides something important to society. And then this outer human and planetary ceiling. So the limits that we should not, that universities and academic life should not overshoot, including workload, commercialization, competition and individualism, as well as, of course, the planetary impacts. So what we suggest in the paper is that modern academia and the neoliberal university increasingly fall short of providing this social foundation while also overshooting the human boundaries as well as our planetary boundaries. And what we want to do is move academia into this space where we can thrive in balance and enable academic action amongst academics on the climate and biodiversity crisis. So I'm going to hand over to Anna now, who's going to talk about these 7 unhelpful ways of thinking and the new ways for rethinking academia that we have proposed.
Maybe I should start by quickly seeing if there's any questions so far. Feel free to drop them in the chat. We can read them out, and we'll keep an eye on it. And we took Raworth's 7 lessons and each applied them to the academic context as we see them. The first one is to change the goal. So currently we often we can observe the historical pattern, and many sociologists have written about this as the increasing running a university or a scientific institution as a business. So we depicted this with more and more graduate students, more and more papers that we all need to write, more and more grants that we need to win. And this is enabled by an increasing demand for accountability, where across different countries, we see that there's more and more fixation on metrics in and of itself. We have the H-index, we have now also altmetrics, for instance, and many of this takes away from the core tasks for a job, research, teaching, and outreach. So we think that although it might be one of the most difficult things to do, to take a step back and to rethink the goal of the university. And the goal, of course, that we propose is to, rather than only following these more corporate neoliberal principles for what the university should be, to really start from this donut and to think not only about what we want to achieve, but also the boundaries within which this should stay. And then the question that then is crucial for this is, so what are universities actually for, right? How are we not just a business, but actually a very different kind of organization that is really there to preserve and cultivate and extend humanities knowledge? So we think some of those questions are really at the heart of also then enabling academics to take a more active role in activism. So that's lesson one. The second one is to get savvy with systems. And here, we have observed in our countries, but I think it's true in many places around the world, that many academics, especially early career researchers, feel that they're cogs in the machine, that we learn early on to kind of play the game, to publish papers in certain outlets because we know it's good for our career, not necessarily for the science we do, for instance. And we see increasing levels of mental health problems, busyness, and bureaucracy that come with science. And there can be a sense that this is just how science works. So instead, we think that these historical examples that we see from scientific activism show that we can really be more kind of dynamic gardeners, we call it, of this system. And to point to a few examples, which we do in the paper, where kind of small seeds have grown into bigger initiatives. And I think for me, also this Growing Up in Science series is really one that has created a very positive change in this specific neuroscientific community, but also other movements pushing for diversity in science and the open science movement, to which we will come back. So that gives at least me some hope that, change can start small, but it can then percolate and things can happen quickly. The third lesson is to see the big picture. And here we want to step away from the historical view of academia as being this ivory tower, this learned men, usually that we think of them still as men, kind of observing the world with their telescopes and microscopes. And not really participating or depending on that world, on the economy, society, and the earth. And we instead see that there's an increasing awareness and acceptance of the fact that we're embedded in our society, which we could see, for instance, in recognizing our own biases that can be racist, sexist, or otherwise, and the cultural norms that we bring, and an increasing these attempts, I think, in many scientific communities to accept cultural diversity and to be more open to it, but also that society lives on the earth. And there, I think that the climate aspect, and specifically the climate footprint of academia, is getting more attention. For instance, in ideas about how much should we all fly, like how much waste does our lab work generate. But we also think it's important to not just stay with our immediate carbon footprint, which might be kind of the easy thing to measure, but to think more broadly of a concept that has been called the climate shadow, or the climate handshake, which is also the positive social action that you can have by talking to people, by setting different norms, and by really making this a larger social multiplier, if you wish, rather than kind of sticking with your own coffee cups or so, which is really helpful, but it's by its nature kind of limited. It stops at you. And we think universities can play a massive role in changing these social norms about how we have organized our societies. right, the fourth lesson we took from Raworth is to create to regenerate. Now, in the original work, that is mostly about regenerating resources, like planetary resources, but we wanted to focus this on human resources and to better support the human limits that we all have and to create more structures that allow the human beings that we are to thrive. So to move away from this feeling of academia as the rat race, that we're constantly chasing the next thing and that more is always better, towards a more holistic and, if you will, slow science, which some people have proposed. There's a wonderful book, The Slow Professor, which we recommend, which benefits our personal lives, our relationships with our colleagues and students, but can also benefit our science itself, making results more reliable and giving us more time to actually do better science and think also more about what it means. Another part of this is that we think teaching is very often seen as the underdog of academic life. It's sometimes called the teaching load, and many kind of want to get away from it to focus on their research, because that is what's most often rewarded in our careers. And we think it's really important to include teaching and education, especially for these generations that are growing up with the climate crisis. All right, number 5 is nurture human nature. Here it's a bit related to the previous one, but we think there's another positive development that has already started of moving away a bit from what we call the lone genius, where we still see a kind of image of a scientist, sitting at the bench late at night and making discoveries, towards a more team science and holistic approach of how scientific products are created, where we see an increasing appreciation for diverse career paths, really people that can specialize and work as parts of teams, which also requires us to broaden the definition of what academic success is. Then the 6th lesson, I'm going to go through it a bit quickly because I want to make sure we have enough time for some nice discussions, is to design to distribute. And here we think we should be quite critical of the ways that we distribute our own resources. These vary, of course, tremendously between countries and between parts of the world. But even within countries, funding mechanisms very often create what has been called the Matthew effects, or the rich get richer, where getting a grant early on or getting that paper early on will kind of set you on this path to success, which really concentrates resources, prestige, and power, and thereby decrease the diversity of people who are involved in the scientific process. So in the paper, we also highlight a few very concrete examples. For instance, distributing some part of funding by lottery rather than always by reviewing, and also working towards a fairer distribution, not only of funds, but also of knowledge that we can see in the open access movement, for instance, and by making the products of scientific knowledge available worldwide. The last lesson is to be agnostic about growth. And Clare already mentioned this, that a core part of our current economic models and political models is that we need to grow. And this is very often also quite inherent, I think, in how we think about science, especially the natural science, that we're always building more. But we think that this has overshot, this focus on growth, and has led us to this publish or perish mentality, which, for instance, in psychology has also given us the replication crisis. And we think instead there's some positive movements away from growth and towards building more trust. And this can be in our own work, for instance, by doing replication work, by really assessing the reliability of our science, by revisiting theoretical principles, to also put a higher value on preserving and rediscovering historical knowledge rather than kind of always moving to the next thing. And we also think that a really important aspect of this, especially in the context of climate, of course, is trust by society, which is another kind of threat both to science and society, which I think we should all be, which I'm very, very worried about. And so, we think that with these new ways of thinking and hopefully also new ways of viewing. We made these drawings also inspired by Raworth, who provides these new kind of visual axioms for thinking about the foundations of a field, that we can inspire more people like you who are here today, but perhaps also more of our colleagues to get involved in advocacy and activism. And as Claire already mentioned, this is nothing new. Already since the 50s, academics have spoken up for current issues in the world, for instance, nuclear weapons. And more recently, we do see many more people stepping up. So for instance, this is a photo from Trinity College Dublin, where neuroscientists team up to campaign for reproductive rights. And we're seeing now, I think there's this era of protest movements might be kind of ramping up again, and we see more and more people getting involved. And we think that climate is really the cause that should be at the top of our minds. So yeah, we hope that you'll kind of take some of these suggestions and new ways of thinking and looking at academia and think about what it could mean for you. So we are optimistic also from our own experience in our institutions that change can happen from individual action if you make it a collective thing. So these individual actions that we can take, they're not sufficient to bring about change, but they are necessary. Like someone needs to start a sustainability committee or petition the university board to make change. And what is also hopeful, I think, is that empirical science shows that there are these tipping points in social norms where often if around 25% of a group adopts a new norm, the whole group can change. And we have already seen this definitely in the Netherlands, for instance, where, for instance, smoking used to be very much socially accepted just a generation ago and is now unthinkable to smoke in public buildings, for instance. And so that's the type of societal change on a much bigger scale that we are going to need with climate action. So yeah, it's really nice to see so many of you here, and we hope that this can be a start of some part of a community building as well, where we are really curious to hear your questions and also to get hear more from you about what kind of things you would like to do. We have a couple of suggestions. For now, maybe I'll thank you here and kind of open the floor for any thoughts, questions, and other ideas that you want to share. Feel free to turn on your video and let us know what you think of these ideas.
Thank you so much, Anne and Claire. I'll start with one question. So I really like your framework for sort of a holistic framework for community and slowing down and putting sort of like taking away this rat race and this focus on growth. But it's not so much about climate here, right? Like this is more like about how to make academia a healthier place. So what would you say to the people who are actually looking for concrete actionables? Like, should I start by pushing for divestment in my university? What if the board of trustees is full of corporate executives who protest that? Should I devote my time to lobby local politicians?
Yeah, so I think you're right. Like this paper, we did not write it to give super concrete starting points for climate action, but we're pointing to many groups that have already done a lot of work on this. So I think here at the bottom, you'll see, for instance, we listed Scientists for Futures, an organization that I'm involved in the Netherlands, and they are in many countries in Europe, as well as Scientist Rebellion. In the UK, there's Faculty for Future. We created a climate action neuroscience and psychology Slack community. SCAN is another community, NYU, doing activism. And I think these questions are best answered by teaming up with local people. So it's a bit hard to answer the specific question about divestment because it's so institution dependent, right? So I think what we here try to do is to help people maybe just tip them over the edge of actually engaging. For me, for instance, joining the kind of sustainability network platform at Leiden University has just put me in touch with all sorts of people who are thinking about these issues, which it will take some time to identify where you can best act. I think that would be, for me, the most powerful thing I could suggest, rather than any very specific action.
Yeah, no, I like that view. Just saying, I'm so inspired. It was so great to see how you connect these various issues. Yeah, no, I think you're both completely right that there's this ingrained prejudice that academics should not be activists, and it's great to see this history that it has been different. And I think it's really time to break out of that, because everything we do is political, if we want it or not. And inaction and ignoring societal problem is political itself. So you're being political no matter what.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's a really key insight. I don't think people kind of often grasp, Weiji, that doing nothing is actually upholding the status quo. And so, you know, it is taking a position by and making the mistake of thinking that you can be neutral. But I think it also, I mean, I think that the kind of hesitancy that people feel about taking a very active stance on climate just underscores how incredibly successful the disinformation campaign of the fossil fuel companies has been. That we feel that this is something that is so controversial, that is, you know, potentially either just controversial or that we're being alarmist, you know, and that maybe we're wrong. and you know, every bit of the science is so emphatic on this, that we're not wrong, and we can feel it every day. But I think that, you know, the fossil fuel companies can take a lot of credit for a very, very successful disinformation campaign. I'm just going to share, sorry, another.
Are there other questions? If not, I'm happy to also share a slide which I made for a slightly different talk, which is much more kind of concretely oriented.
There's a question.
Things
there's two questions actually. So Nicholas, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Otherwise, I'll just read it. So how is general distrust of science being addressed, and what can be done further? The disinformation about climate change is so pervasive, as Claire just said.
Yeah, I guess like one thinker who I find very inspirational, and this is Catherine Hayhoe. She's a climate scientist from Texas, and she's written quite extensively about connecting with people on this issue across quite wide ideological divides. She wrote a book called Saving Us, and she really starts from connecting on shared values. That if you are, you know, talking with a colleague or that neighbor who might, you know, come from a very different place, to not necessarily start with like, okay, the climate crisis is here, but to stay more locally, like, okay, water shortages, or you know, how have people seen the temperature change? Those are just two examples that I remember from her book. And I think she's because she is a Christian climate scientist living in kind of deep in Texas. I think she has some ideas about bridging that. But I think in general, you know, media have a huge role to play. It's a really complex and very country dependent.
And part of it is, you know, I mean, the calls for you know, scientists to become stronger advocates. Also, you know, part of that is just communication, is science communication, and you know, we all have you know, huge responsibility to try our best to communicate the science and to see where it has been misinterpreted, or where there is misinformation or disinformation, to try and address it. I think, you know, a lot of people are really worried, and I think rightfully so, about the new AI chatbots and what this, you know, kind of proliferation of automatically generated content is going to do to they call it information pollution. I think it's Amy Westervelt has that great term, information pollution, online. And, you know, there's huge effort, there are huge efforts being undertaken, huge research being put into how can we equip people to spot disinformation. How can we better teach our children and everybody how to think critically about sources of information, because for sure that is a huge problem. But part of it is scientists kind of becoming better communicators to the public.
Okay. Next question is for Simone, and then after that, Chris. Simone, do you want to unmute? Sorry, we don't hear you. No.
Okay, thank you. Great. I think I'm unmuted now, right? Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
I wanted to ask a question and maybe bring up a point as well. Thank you for the wonderful and inspiring talk. I have read the paper and it's really driven some personal introspection about what I can do and how to encourage change in the environment around me. I wanted to ask what if you had any thoughts or insights into the intersectionality of these issues, particularly, so I am a queer person in science, and a lot of my advocacy is specifically targeted to these kinds of issues. And while I do understand that at a minute level or a local level, this doesn't necessarily affect our fight for climate equality or the fixing of the climate crisis, but that the movement and I think what your piece does very nicely is to emphasize that doing the small actions that you can with these larger ideas in mind. You don't have to necessarily be directly fighting for climate or acting in climate. So my first thoughts are to the unionization efforts that are taking ground across the country, and I think is very inspirational, but that the very act of creating a union institutes power to the people such that they can have a bigger influence on those that have entrenched power, but as large individuals. And so I was wondering if you had any more insights or any thoughts on that in regards to your specific focus on the climate crisis.
I can go first. Simone, that's exactly why we wrote the piece, right? The idea that these issues are so intersectional, and that, we kind of talk about it as being that the people are so bogged down in all the kind of crap of the university that they haven't got headspace. And so the ways in which the university fails to provide that social foundation are going to differ for different people, and for many people it is to do with identities, with the university not being a safe space for their identity, not providing a stable, reliable source of work, like providing a huge source of stress about whether the contract will be renewed in 3 months, or whether the university will switch the modules that they have to teach once again in order to justify re-employing them on a 3-month contract. So there are absolutely all of these different issues that we really wanted to kind of call out, and we couldn't really do each of them justice. And I do feel like we didn't maybe address some of the intersectional issues that we should have. But that was absolutely a motivation behind that entire piece, and the idea that we have to address these major shortcomings in university and in university culture, because just as the idea that if people can't put food on the table, people can't think beyond the end of the month, then how can they think to the end of the century? And we have to address, social and economic injustice in order to, as part of addressing the climate crisis, because the same thing is at the heart of both, right? The same problems are at the heart of both.
Thank you, Chris Fisher.
See. All right. Finally, everyone can hear me. Good. Thank you both for giving this talk. And I just before I ask my question, also just want to say to Simone, I really like that point as well, that to me, addressing the power gap in academia is kind of central to affecting change. There is a generational divide between, I think, folks that have more of an interest in addressing these problems. And as a result, it's helpful to making sure that they're rising up the ranks. Anyway, so my question is actually sort of a good hop off from that. In my experience, there's a lot of entrenched behavior in academia, although not just in academia. And really what I'm wondering is, what do you see as some kind of first steps for addressing entrenched behavior at an institution and using that as really as a springboard to affecting broader change?
Yeah, I could speak from my experience in a few very different institutions. So my postdoc institution was a very small research institute where it was, I think there were 500 scientists, and it was relatively easy to kind of find the, find the director of facilities at the bar, be like, hey, why don't we have solar panels? So I think if you're in a place like that, that might be a great a starting point. I'm now at a much larger university where there's regulations at the university level, then at the faculty level, then at the institute level, and then at the department level. So it's like many layers of hierarchy. And there, I think it's partially also to do a bit with personality. I think if you're more of a person who feels comfortable kind of joining the kind of advisory board, many larger universities have student councils or student and employee, like official, let's say, political representation that's built in. Unions are, of course, a good one, which is more from outside. But if you feel like that within your institution, this entrenched power is just too strong or it's too frustrating, I've also taken a lot of energy from academic climate action groups like Scientists for Rebellion, Scientists for Future, that work not necessarily at your institution, but that can work at the national level or even at the international level. So it's also a bit to, I think that the trick is a bit to find a community where that gives you energy and where you feel like you can make some change. And that could also differ between career stages.
Just to add to it as well, I think that it's a mirror of what we need to do out in broader society, right? So there's often this kind of discussion of the tension between individual, do we need individual behavior change, or do we need top-down regulation? And so in the university, we need both, right? We need grassroots, you need change on the behalf of individuals, changes that we do and we talk about, and we kind of create an upward social pressure from the bottom. But then those of us who have roles where we can bring about institutional changes in, what you're allowed to do in the university, that may not, some of them may not be popular. I mean, there's things that we have to change in terms of whether you can drive to work, whether you can, fly quite as much as you have, or looking at alternatives to flying. Or I know that some universities in continental Europe have rules like you cannot take a flight if you can get a train that's less than 3 hours or something like that. If you're part of committees or decision-making bodies that can actually bring about new rules in the university, then you can help to shift some of those harder behaviors as well. And so I think that's one of the other things that we're trying to encourage is that sometimes people don't realize the power that they have through their membership of some of these committees. And just to kind of say really briefly what happened to me is that I was on one of these committees, and it just hadn't occurred to me that I could kind of bring my climate, persona, or my climate lens. And it was only when I found other colleagues in the university who were like me, who felt like me, who were really motivated and really activated, that I suddenly realized, like, oh, I can actually do this. I can say, hold on a second now, I don't know if we should approve that because it involves a field trip to somewhere. Is that really necessary as part of that module, as part of that educational experience? Could we look at whether there's an alternative available? And that's just one really small example, but there are loads of different ways that you can bring a climate lens, or the Doughnut, like an intersectionally informed lens to the roles that you have.
Maybe one small thing just to add again, which came to mind, we read about it in the paper, that there's this work on the false social reality, that many people think that they're much more worried about climate, but that people around them are not, and that everyone thinks this. So we all think that we're the only ones worried. And I think breaking out of that silo is already, can kind of, I don't know, for me, it's kind of opened the floodgates, and then just knowing that other people also care. And then together, some of those inert structures can start to slowly move. Yeah. There's another question. Do you want to just speak up? If anyone else has a question, raise your hand or type in the chat.
Yeah, so some of you might have seen Anna's response to Kirit about green labs, and you may want to check out those links. We'll also post them on the Growing Up in Science website later. And Chris, your last comment, I completely agree. Like, it's pretty fucked up that academics are discouraged from public outreach and advocacy, because that should be the role of academics. And
right, yeah, and even that's how we'll all survive and continue to do this work. So yeah, it's an unfortunate reality that because of all of these pressures, there's a need to be ultra competitive, and that means that when you have a student that's interested in taking action, you might not let them or not want them to.
Yep.
And if they do it anyway, how do you treat them?
Yeah.
And
I'm personally very encouraged. Yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, wait, you go ahead.
You go first, Claire.
I think some of the achievement, picture of success stuff is really tricky to change, and that's going to take longer. But there still are ways, there still are, again, people, I think we already maybe said this, a lot of our comments are really targeted at, or the greatest responsibility for action lies with those who are tenured, right? Those of us who are privileged enough to have secure positions. And in some ways, that's what enables us to do what we do, because we don't have to worry quite as much anymore. But we get to be on promotions committees or hiring committees, or, there are ways in which we can, start to shift these criteria a little bit, or at least push to shift them. So sorry, Waity.
No, I completely agree. I also very much agree with Anthony, who's saying to do outreach, you just need to start. The more you appear in public, the more the media in particular will talk to you. Opinion pieces are often a good start. And so I think as academics, we often have this fear that nobody will listen to us, or we have no authority, but that's also BS. And you can definitely be influential with the expertise that you do have. One great example that I know is this group in Virginia Science Community Initiative, I think. Here's the link. It's a group of students who are not necessarily environmental science students, but they've been effectively fighting this pipeline using scientific and even legal arguments now. So you'll find ways.
Yeah, I think Anthony Staines has commented, you need to do both play and subvert the rules. I think it's walking that line that is tricky. Yeah, that you need to, and sometimes you can feel very conflicted about where you land on those, but sometimes trying to play the long game, I suppose, is the answer.
David Purple has his hand up. I'm going to unmute you, David.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, a really terrific discussion and topic, obviously. I mean, I agree very much with Claire and Weiji that so those of us who have the privilege of security and sit in the kind of positions where we can, you know, we've been doing a crappy job by just because we simply prolong the criteria for academic success. Right, so that's with respect to students, but also, as I think either Claire or Wade said, with respect to our hiring practices. And so it's going to take a long time because it's going to take a whole bunch of us to rethink about how we prioritize criteria about what we want in academic life and academic colleagues. And that means, you know, re-educating ourselves as committees and as hiring committees and as committees admitting students, and that's going to probably take a generation or more than a generation because it's deeply ingrained of how we think of academia. I think it's exactly right. If we don't speak up, who will? I mean, we have the benefit of information and the kind of training that allows us to evaluate evidence, you know, for or against. And if we don't actually speak up, it's not obvious who can actually do anything. So we have, in some sense, I agree with, you know, Bertrand Russell or Noam Chomsky. We have moral obligations to take a stand, not, you know, fanciful, deep moral obligations.
And to those
Could I respond to that?
of you who are still trainees, it might be encouraging to see that there are people sort of who are now sort of settled at the top of academia who are supportive of outreach and advocacy and public activism. And you'll probably also find those if in your own local community if you look.
Could I make another point in response? Because I think one trend that we've highlighted a bit in the paper, which makes me quite hopeful, is the changes in open science practices, which when I started my PhD, there were no preprints. That was like 10 years ago. And now I'm on 2 hiring committees now, and open science practices is one of the factors that we rate alongside of publications and other things. So that makes me, I mean, it's still a decade, like it's not going to be here next month, but I wonder if also those who have been around longer, you know, what other big changes you have already seen. And I think there can be these moments that feel a bit like they have this great momentum where all of a sudden the norms in a field really do change. So I'm curious if that makes you a bit hopeful. Maybe a question to David.
Yes. I mean, I think it's a start, right? I mean, so not all of us are going to say join Extinction Rebellion or something like that, right? Although maybe we should. But the yeah, those are steps, but those are baby steps, right? Those are just incremental little things. And the question is how to amplify that, how to accelerate that. And how to value, and I forget who said it, maybe it was Chris Fisher earlier, that, you know, how do you feel like you're not just seen as part of a legitimate community, but in fact, rewarded for being serious about these topics. It's not some kind of sideshow, right? It should be just part of your intellectual work. It's not a flourish, it's central to the intellectual concern. And so, yes, open science is going to make a big difference because it signals something about, like, but that's, I think, more generic and doesn't help us so much with the specific issue of climate. And this is what Wei Ji was asking at the beginning, right? So these are great ideas about improving our sense of how we work as academics. But I do think it's important that we, for some of the issues, to really focus on how do we deal with what's the most crucial crisis of arguably our life, our planet, our future.
Julia, do you want to ask your question? I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Great. Hi there. Thank you so much for this discussion. I'm so empowered to find like-minded folks. I'm an ecologist and am really active in the open science community, and am loving the intersection more and more between climate and open science. And now this piece with Doughnut economics and like what to do in academia and how to think about how no action is a political stance is so powerful. So I just wanted to really just share a few resources like the Open Climate Campaign, which is a partnership with Creative Commons and the Open Knowledge Fund. I think there's a really awesome intersection here with open tech and how like the same tools you use for your data analysis can help you post a website and create a community like that example with Virginia, so that we can find each other and learn from each other and see each other's stories and repeat them. And there's also a lot of groups working in the open science space around incentives for tenure and like sharing things earlier and how we can like plug into that with climate change and turn up the need, because we don't have a generation to change these norms. We have to like accelerate that a lot faster. So I just want to share a bit of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And maybe a question from me. So Claire, you mentioned Adam Aron, and he is remarkable in that he actually changed his research program from cognitive neuroscience to climate related behavioral psychology, essentially, behavior change psychology, I should probably say. How realistic is that for ordinary scientists, right? Like, is there a guide for us to have one component of our research be more climate oriented?
I don't think so. I don't think everybody needs to do that, right? Like, I think that for me, I find myself pivoting in a similar, or wanting to pivot in a very similar way. But I obviously have students and grants and commitments in neuroscience, so it may be something that I do slowly. And I think Adam probably did it kind of over the period of about 7 or 8 years as well. But I suppose people shouldn't feel like they have to give up their science and completely take up a new research area. It's more that that there are many different things you can do through your roles or just in the way you run your lab. Anna, will I share that slide now? Maybe you could talk through some of
Sure,
those. Yeah. So this is from you. I'll let you talk about it. Actually.
Yeah. So this is a slide from a paper that I wrote, led by Charlotte Ray from Sussex, which I think the title was "Climate Crisis and a Logical Emergency. Why should neuroscientists be concerned?" So we outline. So maybe we should have started with the slide, but it's much more concrete. So it outlines some areas in which you can act. In the very center is to talk about it, and this is really to get at this false social reality and to find community and to change the social norms. Then at the top left in yellow, we have our own research, where here I listed a few things that could be specific to people in psychology. So I'm now in the psychology department, and I'm doing a few research projects with master students, for instance, on climate data visualization and risk perception is one example. Another is on carbon labels on food. Grace has just shared her I think, work on climate, and also you can see on her lab website as well, like from a more AI angle, to kind of add even just small projects, right, to your portfolio or so. One project I'm now starting is on the effects of indoor CO2 levels on cognition. So it's another kind of link with neuroscience, like air pollution. And then there's also, of course, in your research, the effect of quantifying your own research impact, like in the lab, especially for us, those of us doing wet lab, but also for computing. It's a big, huge topic. Then on the bottom left, we outlined in this paper several things in our academic life. So that's a bit more like flying less, which has a big community. I think on Twitter, there's like hashtag flying less and some accounts, doing science more slowly, being open about it. But also, I think Claire already mentioned this, like if you're on a review panel for something, right, take this into account. Or maybe you're on the ethics committee and you want to see whether indeed the environmental factor might be a part of ethics applications, for instance. Then we had in our institution, so there are some of these things are also very closely linked with what we mentioned under kind of find your allies. So join a sustainability committee, you know, get your students involved. I now often, when I introduce myself to new groups, even when I teach about cognitive modeling, I just list it as one of my interests, or sometimes I just mention that I'm like working on these things, and sometimes nothing happens, but sometimes some students come to me and they're really grateful for just bringing that up. Divestment was already mentioned. And then at the bottom right, we have the more, you know, inform the public, vote, but also contact your representatives. And here, I think it's also really powerful, at least this has been the case for me, to team up with other academics in organizations like in Europe. There's Scientists for Future, where we're now asking our university boards to bank sustainably, so to move away from banks that invest a lot of money in the fossil fuel industry. So those are also other pathways through which you can have a broader societal impact. So yeah, maybe I'll leave this slide here, and you can check out the paper. And actually, I think unless there's any immediate questions, we had another slide. Maybe you can just forward it, where I asked already a little bit in response to David's question, like, I'd be curious to know if you feel motivated by some change that you have already seen, maybe change that you initiated or that someone around you initiated, that gives you a sense for how to bring this about. And I'd be happy to hear if you have any stories to share. If not, I think we can also start to wrap it up. Probably.
Yeah, so it's probably a good time to wrap up.
Yeah.
So I just typed in the chat that I'm going to collect the links from the chat and then put them on the Graph Science website, and then with the YouTube video of the recording of this event. Thanks everyone for your contributions. Unless there are more questions right now, which doesn't seem to be, then thank you so much, Anne and Claire. And let's hope that this is just a first step for many of us, and we can find each other. The Slack channel is probably the best way to immediately connect. Anna, do you want to just post that link, or Claire once more? So if you are eager to continue the conversation immediately, then or not right now necessarily, but then that would be a good place. Yep. Thanks everyone.
Hope to see
you. Thank you, and thank you everybody. It was really great.
Thanks for your questions.
And yeah, happy for people to reach out directly as well, particularly anyone local to me who wants to get things moving in Ireland.